The diesel locomotive in America replaced the steam locomotive both in passenger and freight service, largely through the efforts of EMD, the Electro-Motive division of General Motors, when GM owned the business. The company started humbly as the Electro-Motive Engineering Company in a rented building in Cleveland in 1922, designing, marketing, and maintaining gas-electric rail cars that doubled as passenger and light freight cars. EMC didn't build these cars, known as doodlebugs, themselves. They relied on the St. Louis Car Company, Pullman, and even General Electric to build the cars, with GE supplying motors and control systems, and the Winton Engine Corporation supplying the gas engines. EMC, as the company was known then, was doing well until the Depression put a crimp in sales. General Motors was interested in Winton's diesel engineering and, to gain some expertise, bought the company in 1930. GM also decided to include EMC, at the time Winton's biggest customer. By the mid-1930s, diesel locomotives had already proved their value in yard switching, but the greater market appeal was in modern passenger locomotives to replace the steam, smoke, and soot endemic to the head of most passenger trains up to that time. Union Pacific was in a race to beat the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy to modernity, so EMC put a gas distillate engine in the Union Pacific's aluminum M1000 because a suitable Winton diesel engine was not quite ready. The result that Pullman built looked like a tapeworm from Mars, but it worked and caught the public's attention. CB&Q followed soon after with the Zephyr, built by the Budd Company and powered by the newly designed Winton 201A 8-cylinder, 600 horsepower diesel engine. This was America's first diesel-powered passenger train, and it looked a lot more like the future passengers expected. Thousands gathered along its tracks in 1934 as it made its historic run from Denver to Chicago at an average speed of 78 miles an hour and a peak speed of 112.5 miles per hour. All the train models in this history of EMD are S-scale, that is 1/64th scale, to show what is and what has been available in a scale that many modelers consider the perfect size. When EMC began planning to build its own diesel-powered passenger locomotives, Chief Engineer Richard Dilworth decided on experimenting with two 201 12-cylinder 900 horsepower diesel engines in the sturdy and economical design of the simple boxcar for the first 5 demonstrator models. 2 such locomotives would together provide 3,600 horsepower, which proved more than sufficient to meet the railroad's demands for fast, reliable passenger service. GE built 3 demonstrators, EMC's 511 and 512, that went to Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and to Santa Fe for road testing, and the Baltimore and Ohio No. 50. The St. Louis Car Company built a twin set, Santa Fe No. 1, for the road's new Super Chief. Refinements came quickly to these demonstrator models as General Motors began to build its own locomotive production facility in LaGrange, Illinois. Railroad engineers were concerned about their exposure sitting in the very front of a high-speed locomotive in case of a collision. They also faced the risk of becoming mesmerized by seeing thousands of rail ties passing almost immediately in front of their eyes for hours. EMD designers and stylists worked on redesigns of the diesel locomotives to lift the engineer's cab higher and behind a rounded nose that blocked the immediate view of ties speeding below and offered much better protection in case a locomotive struck something on the track. The locomotive face that millions have grown to know and to love took its first shape. The lifted cab offered better protection for engineers. The grill work for engine air and cooling was moved from the front to the sides, where dirt, bugs, and birds would not collect. The look was now one of graceful speed with a streamlined, sloping face. The first model was Baltimore and Ohio's EAEB model, the E standing for the 1,800 horsepower provided by 2 900 horsepower diesel engines. Over time, the original sloping nose gave way to the more practical, blunter nose that appeared on EMD's freight locomotives, and the horsepower increased dramatically to 2,400 horsepower. but the E series remained as EMD improved its lengthy passenger units to the final E9 model built in 1964. EMC wanted to offer more than just passenger locomotives. Freight was the railroad's moneymaker, so in 1939 EMC offered a nationwide sampling of the FT locomotive, the F standing for 1400 horsepower, rounded up from 1,350 horsepower from a single engine, and the T for twin in a semi-permanently coupled AB consist. The exaggerated sloping face that first appeared on the E-series passenger locomotives was lessened to allow more practical coupling between faces, and this look became known as the bulldog face, still used today to represent American locomotives even 60 years after the last one left the EMD factory. EMC's FT-ABBA consist convinced most railroad executives that the days of steam superpower were numbered. 2 years later, GM renamed EMC to EMD, the Electro-Motive division of General Motors. Little-known N. Horning Industries introduced the first bulldog look in a plastic scale model in 1953. These models were originally meant to decorate railroad executives' desks, but with the addition of motors became running models. It took Gilbert American Flyer 8 years before they offered their own inexpensive Pikemaster version in 1961, and the cost cutting is painfully obvious. 21 years later, American Models produced their FP7 in 1982 and revived interest in S-scale modeling with a good-looking, accurate, and very reliable plastic locomotive. The traveling public was thrilled to see modern, streamlined, and handsomely painted diesels replace the dark, smoke-belching locomotives of the past. In many cases, those older steam warhorses were shuffled off to do heavy lifting and hauling on branch lines, out of sight of the public, and they introduced the branch line BL-2 model with a reworked design that included an inward flared rear to improve sight lines for better visibility of the rolling stock the diesel was pulling. It was a half step and not widely accepted. EMD only sold 59 of them. Alco had a better design alternative in their combination road switchers in their RS series. The only problem was that they were Alco locomotives. Richard Dilworth addressed the market with EMD's strengths as the leading producer of diesel locomotives and standardized parts as well as some new ideas. Quote, "In planning the GP," he said, "I had two dreams. The first was to make a locomotive so ugly in appearance that no railroad would want it on the main line or anywhere near headquarters, but would keep it out as far as possible in the back country, where it could do really useful work. My second dream was to make it so simple in construction and so devoid of Christmas tree ornaments and other whimsy that the price would be materially below our standard mainline freight locomotives. The result was the EMD General Purpose, or GP7, bidirectional locomotive that used standard, familiar, and readily available EMD parts, easily accessible along walkways on both sides of an engine hood, similar to Alco's road switchers. The locomotive was a hit. Too much of a hit, in fact, because the railroads preferred the GP's flexibility and lower initial cost to that of the streamliners. Old-time engineers also liked the layout of the locomotive, with its cab moved further back from the nose, not unlike the steam locomotive cabs to which they were accustomed. The GPs replaced not only the branch line steam locomotives, but also the streamlined cab units as those began to retire. Improvements in design and increases in power led to the GP9 and a series of general-purpose EMD locomotives whose most obvious later change was a lowered nose and a designated front to improve engineers' visibility. General Electric had begun to threaten Alco as EMD's biggest competitor with the introduction of the powerful 2,500 horsepower U25B. EMD's initial response was a lesser-powered 2,250 horsepower locomotive that EMD named GP30 to have at least a bigger number than GE in its name, if not a stronger engine under the hood. It was the GP35 that reached GE's 2,500 horsepower rating, but a race was on for even greater power ratings between the two competitors. EMD continued to improve its locomotives, offering a wide variety of options. A new 645 series of engines replaced the 567 series. cowled units appeared in some cases where railroads felt the utilitarian hood units were unsuitable for their passenger trains. The cowled units looked better and provided less wind resistance at the high speeds for which passenger locomotives were geared. Santa Fe purchased FP45 units, and Amtrak and many commuter rail lines added the venerable, speedy, and reliable F40PH to their rosters. As bigger locomotives became heavier and more powerful to haul longer and longer trains, railroads began to prefer six-axle trucks to the general-purpose four-axle trucks for weight distribution and increased tractive force. EMD called the six-axle versions special duty, and their SD40 and SD40-2 versions proved to be two of their most popular locomotives, with sales of 1,268 and 3,982 units, respectively. Despite the SD40 and SD40-2 being EMD's biggest selling locomotives, S-scale versions have only been available in brass models. EMD was now at the height of its market dominance, but GE was catching up with innovations, greater horsepower, and attractive finance and maintenance deals. EMD countered with the SD45, a thirsty 20-cylinder, 3,600 horsepower locomotive just when the world faced a fuel crisis. A new SD50 sought to push the now aging 645 diesel motor to the same horsepower but with lower fuel consumption by using only 16 cylinders in the SD50. But EMD pushed too hard. That locomotive was plagued with reliability problems, blamed in part on unanticipated vibrations. GE caught and passed EMD in sales in the mid-1980s. EMD tried to recover with a new, less thirsty 710 engine that offered 3,800 horsepower in the SD60 that appeared in 1984. This locomotive first appeared with a conventional cab layout and later as an SD60M with a North American safety cab. EMD continued to introduce innovations such as alternating current traction motors, wheel slip control, and trucks with improved adhesion. But GE held on to and expanded its market lead by matching EMD innovation for innovation. The EMD SD70 ACE, introduced in 2004, was the latest in a series of SD70 models with a new version of the 710 engine modified to comply with ever-restrictive emission standards. But EMG's traditional two-stroke diesel engines had an inherent disadvantage to GE's four-stroke versions in terms of emission reduction. In 2015, the SD70 ACE-T4 locomotive appeared with a new four-stroke 1010J engine that met the Tier 4 emission standards implied in the T4 appended to the name. It was an EMD locomotive, but the abbreviation now stood for Electro-Motive Diesel, no longer division. A struggling General Motors had sold its locomotive business to two private equity groups in 2005. 5 years later, Caterpillar's subsidiary, Progress Rail, purchased the company from the equity groups and continues the EMD tradition of building powerful and reliable diesel locomotives, a tradition that celebrated 100 years in 2022. Electro-Motive continues, from company to division to diesel, still as EMD.